Wait, false.
Okay. Oh, you don't have to do anything but that. When you're finished, you push that, okay? Alright?
Social Studies, Chapter 5. Chapter 5, Section 1, French and Indian War. The major powers of Europe, England, France, Spain, and Netherlands, struggle to get money and are constantly competing. The colonies get involved in the contest. The English start to move over into the French territory and start fighting, and Indians are forced to choose sides. Later, General Washington leads soldiers and colonists who march to fight the French, but they were ambushed by the French and Indian soldiers.
In the month of May 1754, a small force of British colonists led by George Washington ambushed a French scouting party in western Pennsylvania. However, the French far outnumbered the British and forced them to surrender. George Washington's unsuccessful expedition into western Pennsylvania was the first minor battle of the French and Indian War, which lasted until 1763. It was called the French and Indian War because the British and their American colonists waged it against the French and their Indian allies. This 9-year conflict was the end of a long struggle over the control of eastern North America. The French claimed vast regions stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Rocky Mountains, which caused conflict because the English had claimed some of this territory as well. The French and Indian War didn't go very well at first for the British. The British tended to fight in the open and in straight lines, which made them no match for an enemy who hid behind rocks and trees. However, the tide of war turned when William Pitt became Britain's Prime Minister. Pitt persuaded Parliament to raise taxes and borrow large sums of money to fight the war, which paid off in 1758 when better prepared and better led British troops began to overwhelm the French and Indian forces. In 1763, representatives of Great Britain, France, and France's ally Spain signed a treaty in Paris. The Treaty of Paris ended the French and Indian War in America and the 7 Years' War in Europe. The end of the war caused a rift between Britain and its colonists. The colonists believed that the British did not treat them with proper respect. These feelings would soon combine with other events to eventually lead into the American Revolution.
Chapter 5, Section 2, Turmoil over Taxation. After the war, the British were not being fair to the Indians, and Pontiac, an Ottawa chief, led an attack on Fort Detroit. Later, they learned French could not fight because of the Treaty of Paris. One by one, Indian nations stopped fighting and went home. The Proclamation of 1763 drew an imaginary line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains that no colonist should ever cross. When the Stamp Act was passed, everyone hated it because they did not want to get taxed on everything like dice and wills and newspapers. Colonists started to say, "No taxation without representation." The colonies came together to boycott British goods. Parliament soon repealed the Stamp Act. In 1770, a large crowd gathered around the building where some redcoats were guarding a house where there was a meeting. They shouted insults and threw snowballs, oyster shells, and chunks of ice at them. The guards panicked and shot into the crowd. When the smoke cleared, 5 people lay dead. This was called the Boston Massacre. Later, Samuel Adams came up with the Committee of Correspondence, which is a group of people who regularly wrote letters and pamphlets reporting to other colonies of events in Massachusetts. Chapter 5, Section 3, From Protest to Revolution. Many men disguised as Indians raided ships full of tea and poured it all into the harbor. By morning, the contents of 342 chests of tea were in the water. Minutemen were a militia who were ready at a minute's notice, hence the name Minutemen. Well, that's all, folks.